Hello, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm finally getting to my top 5 most played games in 2016. Now, this little intro is going to include some spoilers, but before we get into this, I just want to kind of set some ground rules for this top 5 list of mine. I do one of these every year, or at least I have the last 3 years. And an obvious caveat is I can only rate games that I've played. So while I am putting together a top 5 list, it is not in any way extremely comprehensive because I've only played so many games. And this year, more than any, has been extremely, I would say, prolific for quality strategy games. And as a result, I'm sure I'm missing things out. For example, did not play Civilization 6 at all this year. And because of that, obviously it's not in my list because I haven't put a single hour into the game. With that being said, my list is 5 games that I played the most of. Pretty simple and straightforward. It means games that I played the most in terms of playtime, or at least in terms of an impact that they had on me as a gamer in 2016. That does not mean the game had to be released in 2016. For example, I think there are 2 games in here. One was released in late 2015, and one was released maybe as early as 2014. And just because of that doesn't mean they're not in my list. One thing that I found kind of interesting is that toward the end of the year, when you're kind of thinking about, well, what were the top games for me this year, you realize, some games you completely forgot about at the start of the year that you played quite a bit. And I didn't want this to end up being a list of, second half of the best of the very recent. And therefore, remember, this is more just what I played the most of. I know I'm kind of repeating myself at this point. This isn't going to be a comprehensive review. I'm not sure how long exactly this video will turn out to be, but it is going to be something that I hope you guys all enjoy, and it is the 3rd edition of my top 5 list. And yeah, so let's go ahead and talk about some of the games that I was playing in 2015, what those games meant to me, what I think they did right, what I think they did wrong, and without any further ado, the list is in no particular order, so one last caveat there, but let's go ahead and jump in. Oh, and I think it goes without saying that the top 5 list is of strategy and or war games. So there are some non-war game strategy games that I played this year, and I would still evaluate those alongside war games, but the list that we're looking at in particular is limited to war games. But that's just because of the choices I made as far as what's in my list. So it's the top 5 most played strategy games of 2016. And with that said, now let's go ahead and jump in. So the first game on my list is going to be a game by Paradox Interactive, the venerable strategy game publisher and developer, and that game is Hearts of Iron 4. I'll probably catch a little bit of flack for this game for including this in my top 5 most played, but I enjoyed it quite a bit, actually. Hearts of Iron Hearts of Iron 4 is the 4th game in the Hearts of Iron series, obviously, and it came out in, I want to say, mid-2016. The game is a sort of a scale, I don't know exactly how to call it. It's not a turn-based game. It's kind of real-time, but with, very heavy ability to customize how quickly the game is moving, and it puts you in control of one of the major powers during World War II. Actually, you can choose from any of the countries, but the game is really designed around you playing as one of the major powers. So Italy, France, Britain, Russia, Germany. And it puts you in control as basically the supreme warlord of that country. What that means is you end up trying to build an army up and trying to prepare yourself for the Second World War. You have to decide how you deal with various events that occur throughout the time of your rule. You also have to choose different tech trees or different diplomatic trees that you want to develop your own industry, choose certain emphases within your military that you want to focus on, be it naval aviation or, ground combat or what have you. It's basically turning you into a combination of George Marshall, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and FDR is kind of what it's doing. And it's a lot of fun. One of the criticisms that I've seen a lot of people level against the game is that it's more simple, it's more streamlined than previous Hearts of Iron games. You don't have 30 or 40 mouse clicks to go in through numerous menus. You don't have control over, cores down to the division level where you're playing a much more active role in combat. And I hear those criticisms out, and all I can really say to that is I didn't really play much of Hearts of Iron 3. I didn't play much of Hearts of Iron 4, and I didn't play any of Hearts of Iron 1. All of those games kind of bounced off me as a strategy gamer. I didn't really, I wasn't terribly into strategy gaming at the time those games came out. I was still in school, and I also didn't have the time or the inclination to try and learn a very complex and obtuse game. And that's what really struck me about Hearts of Iron 4, and what really resonated with me about Hearts of Iron 4 is it's a really easy game to pick up and play. The user interface is gorgeous. The game is really easy to just kind of play around with and figure out. The air combat model leaves a little bit to be desired. The combat in general is a little bit simplified, even for my taste, but it isn't too hard or too complex to figure out and get going. So once a war does really kind of erupt, things like supply lines matter, but really what you're doing is you're kind of setting objectives for your generals. You're dragging front lines across the front. You're assigning soldiers to those fronts, assigning troops to the Balkan front or assigning troops to the French front or whatever, wherever you assign troops to. And then the AI kind of fights it out. It is important for you to make sure that you create contiguous front lines. I made the mistake when I was playing as Italy to leave part of my line exposed. I left my flank open, and the AI, capitalized that, swung around on me, cut off my forces, and destroyed 200,000 Italian troops. So, it is a game that isn't terribly complex when it comes to fighting. Really what you're doing is you're creating your war machine, and then you're watching it go into action after the war starts. That's at least how it plays out for me, with you giving a top-level direction along the lines of someone like Eisenhower, where you're going to say what fronts you want to go to or what objectives you want to meet, but you're not going to be the one saying, all right, 23rd Tank Division, I want you to turn the flank of this guy over here, or what have you. It's much more high level. Again, you're playing as the supreme commander, and I appreciate that. I know, a lot of the Hearts of Iron fans may not, but to me, that resonated and was a heck of a lot of fun. My main complaint with the game is that it seems too compressed, right? It's supposed to be a war game about World War II, so I understand the starting point. I think it's 1936 and 39 are kind of two different starting points, but you really only have, about a 10-year period where the game plays well. It feels like a game that's crammed too much in, and it feels like it's a little bit more about politicking and building your industry than just a World War II game would imply. If you're playing as Germany, even just a 3-year earlier start frame where the Nazis take over would really be useful in allowing you to feel like you're building your military up. If you're playing as, Russia or the United States, I think an earlier start time would really be beneficial to give you more control over how your industry is going to develop. Now, you could say that, most of the military development that did occur in this very condensed period of time, so it's not really a World War II game if you don't, limit it to those years. But it feels to me like a game that if you had the ability to change the way the political structure works, the way kind of imperialism works, you could start it in the middle of the interwar years, or you could start, you could drag it out further into the Cold War. It'll be interesting to see what the DLCs for this game do, because with Paradox, you've got Crusader Kings, which keeps expanding its scope and time of play. You've got EU, which is a little bit more compressed in what they can do, and then you've got Victoria, which is a little bit more open, but again still fits within some very well-defined and limiting boundaries. And then you've got Hearts of Iron 4, which is even more constrained. So I'll be really interested to see how they develop this game going forward. The first DLC is more about kind of different paths for Commonwealth nations. If you play as kind of like the British Commonwealth, it makes playing as some of those minor Commonwealth nations a little bit more interesting. But to suffice to say, I love sort of the industrial control. I've got to figure out how many tanks am I making per week, how many support equipment, how many rifles, how many aircraft am I making per week. Am I expending those at a greater rate than I'm replacing them? Am I not adequately building up and preparing for a war? Is technological development going to cause my army to quickly become obsolete? There's a lot of interesting decisions that you have to make in this game, and it's so damn easy to just get going and get playing and realize you've spent 5 hours in the game that I really enjoyed it, and it turned into one of my top 5 most played games in 2016. But with that being said, let's go ahead and move on and not waste too much time on Hearts of Iron, and we'll take a look at my next game on this list. So the second game on my list is a game by the Aristocrats, if that's how you pronounce it, called Order of Battle World War II. It's published by Matrix and Slitherine Games, and this is one of those games that actually came out in 2015, but I played it a ton in 2016. It's had numerous DLCs that have come out throughout both last year and this year. Morning Sun, for example, U.S. Marines, Blitzkrieg, Winter War, all to name a few. And this game is a turn-based strategy or war game in the vein of Panzer Corps or Panzer General if you go further back. Essentially, you play the role of either, the Axis, in this game's case for the most part playing as the Japanese, or as the Americans or Chinese or, other allied powers. The game started out just called Order of Battle Pacific and took place just in the Pacific Theater. It's since expanded to the Chinese Theater, it's expanded to the Winter War in Finland, it's even gone back into World War II in Europe. And what I really find interesting about this game is, the Panzer Corps or Panzer General style of a hex-based game with turn-based combat resolution and, just sort of like a hit point of 0 to 10 with scenarios that you have to play through and accomplish objectives within a designated period of time. Always felt very puzzly to me. Panzer General holds a special place in my heart as a game that I played a ton on my PlayStation as a kid while listening to Bob Uecker on the radio, spring training and baseball and what have you. But it wasn't the type of game that to me I thought, I'm going to end up playing 30, 40 plus hours of this in a short period of time. It's the kind of game that I'd return to for a little bit of a nostalgia kick. When Panzer Corps came out, I played that quite a bit, but I kind of played through it, and it was sort of, it was one of those things that I thought I was kind of done with. But when Order of Battle came out last year, and I really started playing it a lot more this year, I found that wasn't the case anymore. And that's because they made some pretty big changes from the standard turn-based resolution. For example, you can see on your map in front of you, you've got some red lines that indicate where the front lines are. So they implemented a sort of supply system with front lines where you wouldn't be able to supply if you were cut off, and you'd have impacts to your performance. And I thought that was really interesting and different to the way that a lot of these kind of games work, where they don't generally take into account those factors. I also thought the Pacific Theater setting was very interesting and unique. You don't see a lot of games that cover World War II in the Pacific Theater. You've got a few of the big, massive games like War in the Pacific that definitely touch in that realm, but you don't see a lot of war games that really devil in the Pacific. You've got a lot of Eastern Front games. You've got some Western Front games. There really aren't any shooters, not really war games, but there really aren't any shooters that cover the Pacific Theater. There was a Medal of Honor that I think tried to do so. But in general, you really, the Pacific Theater gets ignored. So that by itself made me want to play it. And then the scenario approach. So I play a lot of War in the Pacific, or I have played a lot of War in the Pacific. And that game's a lot of fun, but there's no real narrative behind it. It's the narrative you create. This game actually has some really well thought out and well put together scenarios. So I got to play as the Japanese invading the Philippines in the Japanese campaign. And that was fascinating. I've never played a game that specifically calls out the Philippine campaign from the Japanese or American side, for that matter, where I had to figure out, all right, how am I going to accomplish my objectives within this set period of time? And it wasn't fighting to the death. It wasn't saying, as the Americans, you're not saying we have to push the Japanese back and win. No, your objective is to delay the Japanese as long as possible, whereas the Japanese obviously are they're in a tight schedule. They're trying to win and overwhelm the Americans in a very rapid period of time. So that was all interesting. The way amphibious assaults are covered, where you have to have ships along the coast that provide supply. So this whole front line and supply route works great. But what if you're landing on a beachhead and you don't have a clear supply route? Well, then you've got to have supply ships that are adjacent to the beach and have a direct line to your troops that they've cleared out and created a front going forward from the beachhead. That works amazingly well for a game that, you have to land troops on an island, push inland, and try and, take over the island. If you've got to have supply ships all along the corner, and then if you're playing as, of that island to provide supply, and then if you're playing as the Japanese and your goal is, okay, how do we win this battle? Well, one way that'll make it really easy is if we wipe out those supply ships, because now we can cut them off from their supply. Or if you're playing as the Japanese on Guadalcanal, the ability to have destroyers provide some supply. I think the addition of logistics to this game, the need to land your aircraft on aircraft carriers to resupply them, the combined operations that are a lot more prevalent in this game than any of the other Panzer General clones. I don't mean that in a negative way. I love a lot of them, but they don't. Often those games do not make you think about logistics and supply, and it leads to a very sort of puzzle piecey kind of game where it's like, I need to move this here, move that there, and you don't really think about things that I think you normally have to in war games. And I think that's what Order of Battle really captures. And I hope that's continued with Blitzkrieg. I haven't played the newest DLC that brings you back to Europe, but that all of those pieces made Order of Battle World War II an interesting game that I spent a lot of time in World War II, or in 2016, and that I also didn't really think I would be. The game came out middle of last year, and I would say most of my time went into it in the second half of last year and the first half of this year. But altogether, it's a really well put together game that's a lot of fun. And if you're looking for a different twist or a different take on sort of that Panzer General style of game, then I highly recommend it. It certainly worked for me. So the third game on this list is another game that I didn't expect or didn't really realize was coming out in 2016. And when it came out, it really caught me by surprise. And I think I fell into a 20 or 30 hour binge in the first couple of days that the game was out, where I just couldn't stop playing it. And that game is Atlantic Fleet by Killerfish Games, who will probably have another appearance on my top 5 most anticipated list, but that's not today. Today we're talking about Atlantic Fleet, which came out in the first half of 2016 and is a game about the Battle of the Atlantic. So the Nazi German Empire's attempt to cut off the flow of supplies across the Atlantic to the British Empire in an attempt to starve Britain out of World War II. And it's a game that I think makes the list in large part because it covers, and does a pretty good job of it as well, it covers a topic that just doesn't get enough attention. I feel like there are a lot of areas in World War II that are somewhat unexplored. The Battle of the Atlantic really gets short shift in terms of strategy games. There are certainly several games out there that cover it in more of a simulation aspect. So if you're looking at the Silent Hunter series, for example, that does a really good job of representing the Battle of the Atlantic from the point of view of a German submarine. And you fight throughout the war as situations change and you attempt to cut off the flow of supplies. But it's not a strategy game. It's a simulation that puts you in control of a single U-boat with no change in the outcome of World War II. And to me, that seems a little bit, it seems too bad. I think there were some attempts at one point in time to kind of make a U-boat commander series where maybe you command a flotilla and maybe you do have an impact. But the Battle of the Atlantic really doesn't get covered much outside of the submarine war. And even within the submarine war, it's generally covered on a captain-by-captain basis and not in the way a strategy game would, where your goal is to figure out what the appropriate strategy is to win the war from the German perspective. And that's exactly what that's exactly what Atlantic Fleet does. Atlantic Fleet puts you either in charge of the British Empire as you attempt to stop German commerce raiding and German U-boats from cutting off your flow of supply and protecting merchant ships as they cross the Atlantic to Britain, or puts you in control of the Kriegsmarine for the Germans, where your goal is to cut the flow of supply to the British Isles. And it is a turn-based game, which I have some reservations about that. I don't really feel like a turn-based game works all that well for naval combat. It doesn't work well at all. It doesn't seem to accurately represent, differing rates of fire. Like, I get one shot from my 5-inch guns every turn, and I get one shot from my 15-inch guns every turn. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe their hit points are modeled in based on rate of fire, but to me, it just doesn't seem right. It does do a good job with armor on ships, so I will call that out. It has some ballistics factors in there that I think accurately represent where armor is strong or weak, but you do see a lot of scenarios where cruisers are taking out battleships, and I'm talking light cruisers with gunfire, so it seems there needs to be some work done there. But where the game really shines is making you, as Germany, figure out, how am I going to cut the flow of supplies to the British Isles? And, am I going to send out these surface raiding ships? Am I going to send out these submarines? What level of effort am I going to put into building new submarines versus opening up new surface ships? It gives you all these decisions. So you've got, prestige that you can use to make certain ships available to you or certain U-boats available to you. It allows you to take a strategy of how you're going to attempt to overwhelm the allies in the Atlantic. And from the British perspective, which I played a little bit less of, it's a little bit more sort of the grindy convoy escort duties where you've got to, make sure you've got the right ships in the right spots and then hope that you can intercept, German ships. Where I think the game really shines is with the early war phases where you've got the German Navy with, large numbers of surface combatants sailing around, trying to play a role against a heavily superior surface fleet of the British Navy. And then you've got submarines mixed in there as well. I don't think the game scales well when you go later war and the German fleet starts to get annihilated and it becomes a submarine war only. I think the game struggles a little bit with just the submarine, combat elements, but the game is interesting enough to me as a quasi Battle of the Atlantic simulator to keep me interested and keep me playing it quite a bit. I played a lot of Great Naval Battles, which was a similar game from way back in the day, except it was more real time. And I thought that game, it's one of those sort of abandonware, one of those really old games. I don't know when it came out, but sometime in the 90s. And this, to me, was a nostalgia kick for it. And it's an area that I hope to see more of. And Killerfish is working on a Cold War, single submarine type Red Storm Rising type game, which I think would be really interesting, because another thing that I didn't mention is that this game is a dynamic campaign. If you didn't catch by the way I was describing everything, your successes and defeats in the Atlantic campaign, they carry over casualties, carry over losses, carry over everything. And there aren't enough games out there with dynamic campaigns. There's something to be said about really well scripted scenarios, but there's also value to having really well and really complex campaigns. This isn't incredibly complex. I think you can even play it on your iPad, but it's a lot of fun outside of sort of the microing of figuring out the range your guns need to fire at, which can be a little bit slow, where you kind of, all right, one degree up, fire, shoot, see what happens, adjust. Those kind of things can be a little bit repetitive, and the battles do get somewhat repetitive over time. But enough was right about this game to keep me hooked on it for quite some time throughout the first half of 2016, and it showed on my channel as I had some, I think, 20-plus games that looked at Atlantic Fleet with various different topics. Anyway, I think I'm starting to ramble a little bit with this game, so let's go ahead and move on to game number 4 on my list, which the next 2 games are not going to be a surprise to anyone who's watched my channel at all the last, 4 months or so. So the 4th game on my list is Rule the Waves, which is made by Naval Warfare Simulations, more often referred to as NWS. And this is a hardcore naval budget and battle simulation. It puts you in charge of a major navy during the era of the pre-Dreadnought and Dreadnought, those rapid arms races and technological developments that occurred from 1900 to 1925. And it puts you in charge of plotting and creating your own navy and figuring out how to deal with all of the challenges of rapidly developing technology and at the same time heightened global tensions around the world. Naval warfare simulations allows you to play battles out in real time, and also allows you to kind of create and design your own ships. To me, it is a gem of a game because I grew up as someone who I played a few forum games that kind of dealt with Europe in crisis, the early 1900s. I didn't think it was an area that was well covered by games. I've read Dreadnought and Castles of Steel by Robert Massey. I read in high school, I remember reading a book on the German East Asia Squadron. Naval combat in a steel castles era really fascinates me. Not World War II is interesting, but carrier warfare is a very different Navy. When you have to see what you can shoot at in order to destroy it, and you don't have push button missiles, but you still have gigantic firepower behind 15-inch guns. That fascinates me. I wrote, a paper in college on the Anglo-German arms race before World War II. So all of these pieces came together to really appeal to me. And while this game didn't come out this year, it's a game that I ended up playing a ton of this year. I did another series. I revisited the game, played it, did a Let's Play, did some streaming, and then did a Succession series with Tortuga Power and XTRG, where we played as France, and we kind of passed off and handed off the reins, where one of us would rule, France for 6 years, and one of us we'd pass it off to the next guy. And in so many ways, this game is just an amazing bucket of fun. And it's interesting because I got the chance to be on the 3 Moves Ahead podcast and talk about this game. And I came away to saying quite a few things that weren't terribly positive about the game. It's a lot of interesting ideas that are all kind of put together in maybe not the most well-designed way. And there's some definitely drawbacks to the way that naval combat is resolved. There's some drawbacks to the way that politics occur, the seemingly random nature of just, these events came up, and this never-ending succession of wars over a 25-year period that really only had one major war, yet it seems like you fight a war every other year. It also makes navies predominantly more powerful and relevant to combat than perhaps they were in this area. And yet, despite all of these drawbacks, it's a game that appealed to so many of my sort of core interests or historical interests that I ended up playing the hell out of this game. And there's a second one that's in the works. I'm a little bit lukewarm about the idea of it going into carrier warfare. I guess we'll see how that's handled by the developer. But I think the interesting thing to me, and to anyone who's really into like fantasy sports or sports simulations, because I play a lot of out of the park baseball as well, is that this kind of game really appeals to sort of the stat head. I want to build this ship, and I've got to figure out how to fund it, and I've got to figure out what my budget is and where things are going, what my priority is, what my strategy is. It's a naval sandbox simulator in a lot of ways, and it's very basic. It's almost like a text-based game. Not quite, but very close to just being one of those old school text-based games, and yet it does quite a lot well, or at least quite a lot in interesting and different ways compared to most of the other games on the market. I think, to me, maybe this list has become more of a what were the most interesting games of 2016 rather than the best games of 2016. And I think that would probably apply to Rule the Waves. Obviously not released, but games that I played this year that were interesting. I found myself spending a lot more times in games that I thought were interesting and unique, and maybe a lot less time in the most well-polished or best games of the year. That's not a shot against any of these games, actually, because now that I think about it, most of these are pretty well-polished and put together, but they're not games that you'd traditionally think of when you say, what's the best strategy game of 2016? I don't think any of the games in my list are going to be on that list. But I would say that they're certainly the most interesting, and maybe the best of the war games out there. And they appealed to me, so I guess that's all I can really say. And with that being said, let's move along to the final game on my list, and I don't think this one's going to catch anyone by surprise either. Okay, and the final game on my list, as I've said, will be no surprise to anyone, and that is Ultimate General Civil War, a game by Game Labs, the sequel to the 2014 hit Ultimate General Gettysburg. In this game, the Civil War expands beyond just one battle and takes you across the entire war from 1861 to 1865. I struggle putting this game on my list because it's still in early access, but I've played this game so much. It's pretty much taken over my channel the last 2 months or so, and that's why I'm including it here. Where to start with this game? It's a real-time game. It's a real-time sort of tactics or strategy game. You play as either the Union or the Confederates. You can play historical battles with historical orders of battle, or, and here's where the game really appeals to me, you can play as a Union or Confederate general where you have to build your army battle to battle. Casualties carry over. You've got to replace your troops. You've got to equip them with weapons, and you need to, ensure that your army is able to continue fighting throughout the war. You have reputation that you gain or lose with successes. You can be fired just as any Civil War general could be. The Civil War was very political. You earn sort of traits that improve the quality of your general, or you lose traits. Well, not really lose them, but you're unable to improve yourself if you fail to succeed. And all in all, this game is really interesting. It has some flaws in some senses. I think the fighting is a little bit arcadey. It's very quick. If you want a really detailed and deep strategy war game that looks at the Civil War, look more for something like Scourge of War. This is more of a, quick pick up and play, easy to play game, easy to figure out, and yet incredibly challenging. The game is going to need to figure out a little bit more effectively how to make things difficult without just scaling the numbers. So criticism I see a lot of people level against the game is that it seems like the only way the game gets more difficult is by throwing more and more enemy at you. It certainly seems to be the case as playing as the Confederates. But there are balancing things that are going on with the game, and it's still in early access, so expect to see that evolve and change with time. At the end of the day, without making this a 20-minute spiel about how much I love this game, the dynamic campaign of playing a series of linked battles where you've got to create your own army and then nurture that army and try and get those brigades to survive and yet still win these incredibly bloody battles is what really appeals to me. The ability to outfit your troops with different quality weapons that'll influence their success on the battlefield, decisions you have to make around, do I want to just flood this brigade with green troops? Do I want veteran troops? Do I want, some iconic historical commanders on my side, or do I need to go with just cheaper, lower quality commanders that all influence how your units perform on the battlefield? And all of that plays into why this game might be my most played game of 2016, and is a game that I absolutely love. It takes what I loved about Civil War Generals 2, which is this old 90s Sierra classic, it puts it into a real-time world with fast-paced battles, easy to pick up and play, gorgeous user interface. It's a treat. And, while there are some growing pains, certainly, just to talk, another thing I really love about the game is, the ability to tie your troops to defensive positions. That's something that I haven't seen any other Civil War game do before. Usually it's like if you're within a certain range of a wall, you get a defensive perk, but the ability to actually tie your troops to that wall, see them deploy out on that wall, and then get the benefits of being behind that stone wall is just one example of how this game really, to me, seems to be crafted and made with passion and with love, and with undoubtable quality. But with that being said, I'm not going to ramble too much. Those are my top 5 games of 2016. You've got Ultimate General Civil War, you've got Rule the Waves, Hearts of Iron, Atlantic Fleet, and then you've also got Order of Battle World War II. So all in all, 2016 was an incredibly strong year, in my opinion, for strategy games and war games. My list focuses less on big AAA titles, as I've said, but I think that's fitting. I don't do a ton of focus on huge games. I'd say Hearts of Iron was the only really mainstream game that I really focus on much, and even that didn't get a ton of playtime on the channel, though I did play it a lot. But yeah, 2016 was a great year, a really interesting year, and there was a lot that came out late in 2016 that I didn't get a chance to really fully dive into because I fell in love with Ultimate General. So I would look to see some games in my list next year that were 2016 games that I didn't get to till 2017. With that being said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this video up. I hope that wasn't too much rambling. I hope I provided some interesting commentary, some games to think about if you hadn't already looked into these, and please feel free to share your thoughts and comments in the chat below. I am working on my top 5 most anticipated games of 2017. That's interestingly challenging because so few Wargames studios put out updates saying, hey, this game is coming. It seems like they just tend to show up. So that'll be something that is coming, that I'm working on, in maybe another week or so before it comes out, or maybe sooner. We'll see. But with that being said, guys, I appreciate you tuning in. Again, 2016 was a huge year for the channel, another record year for views, record year, well, not for subscribers, but a very good year for subscribers. And I had a ton of fun doing it. I've really started jumping in and doing videos a lot more consistently. I may pull back on that a bit rather than posting a video every day, just because it's kind of taken away from my ability to provide actual historical commentary. So we'll see. But I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. I think I've said that for 3 times already. And I'm going to go ahead and sign out now, guys. Thanks again. Happy New Year. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.